All right, so we're going to talk about how it hurts to admit that you're wrong and how that then eventually hurts your business. We're going to be honest with each other for a while, so I just want to say hello to everyone. If you just say your name at the same time, that'd be very effective or efficient. So on three, could you just say your name? So 1, 2, 3. Great. Thank you. Okay, raise of hands. How many of you have estimated the length of a project at some point, right? Okay, so keep raising your hand if you were wrong. Okay, so more hands went up than before. That's interesting. Have you ever estimated the impact of an A/B test? Raise your hand, and then please keep raising your hand if you were wrong, right? So I think the problem is that we're really generally at loss when dealing with the future. We make a lot of predictions and we have a lot of ideas, but we're pretty bad at it, honestly. So just if we have an idea or make a prediction, how do we know if we're right? We usually try the ideas or we guess. It's pretty expensive to try, we run a lot of tests, so we mostly guess. When we guess with money, we usually call that predictions or business plans or analysis, but nevertheless, they are guesses, right? So the challenge is that we're notoriously bad at predicting the success of ideas. I did some research, I dug up some old examples that maybe make you remember how difficult it was. Do you remember your first prediction in life? It's usually something like this. We get asked it pretty often. It's a pretty complex question. What do you want to be when you grow up? Here's Lucas, he's 5. He says, when I grow up, I'm going to work with rocks. For example, I'm going to throw them in the water so it creates a massive splash. It's a good first guess, maybe. Here's a pretty creative one too. When I grow up, I want to be a dog. And then we learn how not to fail when we make predictions. So here's I think future manager. When I grow up, I'm 7. I want to be 8. It's difference between accurate and invaluable, I think. But here's the 3-part guess. When I grow up, I want to 1, get a girlfriend, 2, kiss her, and 3, rule the world. Which, so when I saw this, I thought that that's impossible. But things have happened. We shouldn't judge maybe the ideas of our children. But the point is, we get better at making predictions with time, right? We grow up, we touch a stove, we stop touching the stove because it's hot. Or do we really do that within a business context? I think it's differentiating between causation and correlation. Just that is surprisingly difficult within a business context. And there's this article from Boston Times where Paul, a startup founder, I think, summarized this pretty nicely. He says, so Paul, a startup founder in New York, says that he and his employees are less stressed since they started microdosing. That's taking LSD in water. But he couldn't be absolutely sure about the cause and effect. He thinks it might have also been the project management app Asana, which they started using at the same time to keep organized. So probably the best ad for Asana ever produced. But also, I wish we could be this humble about knowing what actually is causing the change that we're seeing. So we usually say hindsight is 20/20. I don't think hindsight is 20/20. It's just full of preconceived ideas and biases. The thing is that we know of ways that have been proved to produce better predictions. And there's one study in particular that took over 20 years. It's called Good Judgment and Political Forecasting by Philip Tetlock. And they asked people to make yes and no predictions over 20 years. And first of all, depressingly, people were just really bad at predicting the future, worse than chance bad. And these are experts then making predictions within their particular fields. But they managed to establish a causal relationship between adopting certain personality traits and then getting better prediction-making abilities. And they did that through I think just the study in itself is interesting. They had a really big quantitative study they formed an hypothesis around how some behaved. Then they ran basically an A/B test within their own study, isolated different groups and taught them different behaviors, and then established a causal link between learning to do something new and then making better predictions in the future. So just one of the most impressive studies I've seen within psychology. But first of all, you can change a lot of your behavior. You can change your IQ. Making predictions in this context had nothing to do with IQ. But I think we should just go through the opposite first. So what did they found that caused bad or worse predictions? So basically, they summarized that as dogmatism. In other words, you had all of these attributes at the same time. You had strong opinions. You have simple answers to difficult questions. You're confident in the ability of judging, right? You gladly have an opinion in every single instance. This is basically a list of Trump. And then you have one view of the world, and then you update the rules of proof to fit that worldview. For example, if you don't want to believe in climate change and you cite one piece of evidence that you think proves that climate change isn't that bad, and then suddenly that data is updated and you don't have that proof anymore, you're like, no, it wasn't important. I mean, this other data point is really important. So you basically defend your worldview with your high IQ if you have one, leading actually sometimes people to have worse prediction-making abilities because they have a high IQ, because they're better at defending the worldview that they want to keep having. Lastly, you look for facts only to prove yourself right. Now, the problem is that if you ever start behaving in the wrong way, when you behave like this, you're likely just going to get stuck in a weird and destructive loop. So we need to basically behave in the opposite way. So a nuanced way of thinking leads to better judgment. They saw that all these people, first of all, had an open mindset and were pretty curious. And then they had the list with a basically opposite traits. So confident in the difficulty of judging at any given point. You carefully weigh proofs for and against. You have complex answers to difficult questions. You update your view of the world after being exposed to new evidence. And then you look for facts. You look for facts to prove yourself wrong. I wish I could behave in this way. It's really, really difficult. But I think at some of our companies, we do some of these things. Like I've heard of companies, of course, running a user research study to prove themselves right. But mostly, I think we don't do that, right? We run a test and we try to just look for the truth. So we're at points, I think, or at times, at least somewhat close to this. But if we visualize these two ways of thinking, I think a dogmatic way of looking at the world is this. You have one idea of the world, and then as time passes, it's the same idea, nothing changes. If you have a nuanced way of thinking of the world, you have one idea, and then as soon as you get more information, you have two conflicting hypotheses, hopefully. Like you know that they both come true at the same time, but you're fine in being in that state of saying, it's complicated. I don't know. And then you get more information and more hypotheses, and the complexity just keeps on growing. What they also saw in the study is that people with good prediction-making abilities practice something that they labeled delayed judgment. As if I asked someone for an opinion and they hadn't read up on it yet, they would just not judge at that point. In other words, saying, I don't know. They just waited for a while and had an opinion later. Let's talk about why none of this works. Here's Steel Ballmer. I bet you remember this guy. Let's ignore for the next few minutes that I've been now employed at two Microsoft-owned companies the last few years. Here's Steel Ballmer in 2007. There's no chance the iPhone is going to gain any significant market share. No chance it's a $500 subsidized item. Here's an article from earlier this year. CNBC writes, Microsoft recommends switching to iPhone or Android as it prepares to kill off Windows phones. And they, if you saw the last few days, they just launched an Android phone themselves. So let's just make a quick vote. Like, what do you think? What do you think about this statement? So I want you to raise your hand in a second, and then if you think he's wrong, you do a thumbs down. If you think he's somewhat right, you do like a shaky hand. And then if you think he's right, you just raise your hand and do a thumbs up. So if everyone please raise your hand and vote, what do you think of the statement? It's not going to get any significant market share. Right, awesome, thank you. Yes, thank you for voting. Okay, so let's just be kind to Steve and find some nuance. This is the front page of Forbes at the time. The important part being, of course, Nokia, 1 billion customers. Can anyone catch the cell phone king? Right, that's the cool company in 2007. Here's the full quote. So he says, it's sort of a funny question. Would I trade 96% of the market for 4%? So remember that number. That's actually his first real prediction, 4%. Apple will get 4%. I want to have products that appeal to everybody. Now we'll get a chance to go through this again in phones and music players, referring to iPod, if you remember that. Then there's the quote. Then he says, they may make a lot of money, but if you actually take a look at the 1.3 billion phones that got sold, I prefer to have our software in 60 or 70 or 80% of them than I would to have 2 or 3, which is what Apple might get. So there's another prediction down here, 2 or 3 or 4%. It's a range. We know they failed, but at least we can look at what actually Apple got, right? So if we would measure this through, I think we'd reach a fairly high number. But we actually take a look at the world market, which Ballmer is talking about. We can just track the smartphone market. So from 2010 to 2013, this is basically the years where the smartphone market played out. The end result here is what we're living with today, still, right? So follow, please, the black dot at the second, just below the blue dot, which is BlackBerry. So black and green, and just follow that. And if we just play this out, we'll see how Android pretty much just rises quickly. It looks at some point like iOS may take some shares of the market, but Apple or iOS is just below 20, Android around 80, and that's basically the state that the market has been since then. I also think that we gotta give him credit for this. They may make a lot of money. I mean, this is basically Apple's strategy. They're not after market share. They're just after selling a real expensive product to a lot of rich people and then earn a lot of money. So if you would just vote again, could you please just raise your hand? What do you think? Is he somewhat right? Is he right, wrong? A lot of waving hands. Okay, cool. Let's do this again. If you actually take a look at the 1.3 billion phones that got sold, this number is way too big to refer to the smartphone market. Right? It refers to all phones, meaning feature phones, Nokia, plus smartphones. So all the numbers that he's citing is this big piece, not just the small cake, right? So if we map and chart the iPhone share within that during those years, it's the green line. Here's the header for that article. 17 of smartphones, but 4% of all phones, meaning Ballmer guessed maybe 2 to 4%, 2010 it was 4. 2005 it was around 5. And then he referred to iPods and the music scene. They had 74% of the market. So when he says not significant, I think he's pretty right. Here's John F. Kennedy. For the great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often, we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to have prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. Ballmer isn't the problem, right? You are the problem. I'm the problem too. We're all the problem. If you're at this point, though, sitting here thinking, I get your point, but I think I'm right, I'll give you yes, it's complicated. Ballmer might be wrong eventually. He didn't set a time frame for his prediction, right? And smartphone sales continue to increase compared to feature phones, so Apple's share actually continued to rise. But if you spend too much time on that, you're just back here. You're looking for facts to prove yourself right. Right now, we just went through how not to do it. You're just in there with your confirmation bias, having a good time. Richard Feynman, I think, put it very nicely. The first principle is that you should not you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. This, of course, is then how it hurts to admit you're wrong. I was recently in a project at Minecraft where I probably spent more than a year on a project that amounted to basically nothing. We're all obsessed with ROI. ROI isn't exactly great when return is zero, of course. There were clear signs, I think, during this project. The roadmap continuously pushed. We focused repeatedly, focus changed. It was increasingly difficult to justify the product. And we ran quantitative tests, and we ran them, and we proved that it was still a good idea, and we pushed on. And we didn't let go of that project, but ultimately it basically amounted to nothing. And this is what we do when we get attached to our ideas. And it tends to really hurt our business. I think when we have an idea and we really struggle for a while and we have that really nice idea, we're just so happy that we just cling to it. We cling to it and we become best friends with our idea. We do everything with the idea together. And then we realize that slowly, like, the idea is maybe not that good, and it turns on us. But even though it does that, we just continue clinging to it because we don't want to be back in the state of not having a good idea. It's like our processes are agile, but our minds are rigid. Right? We focus so much on being agile, but I think we can't even change our minds for a second. So I think what we need to focus on is to detach our egos from our ideas. The problem is that willpower and reasoning is probably not enough. I found this quote from Kahneman, the author of Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow and Nobel laureate. He said this pretty recently. In terms of my intuitions being any better than they were, no. And furthermore, I have to confess, I'm also very overconfident. Even that I haven't learned. It's hard to get rid of those things. I've been studying that stuff, as in biases, different biases, for over 50 years, and I don't think that my intuitions have really significantly improved. Which is kind of depressing, I think. And recently, several researchers and authors, including Hugo Mercier, Duns Berber, and Jonathan Heath, have all argued that reasoning actually didn't evolve as a method to reach conclusions that makes the most sense. It evolved as a tool to defend our social status and convince others to believe in us. And from that perspective, all of these biases make a lot of sense because they're really effective at convincing others until we make a fool of ourselves, and then they're not great. What we need then, I think, is culture that supports us and systems of thought that support us. And we focus so much on processes that have something to do with agile, like getting everyone into the same boat and making sure that we can react quickly to a changing landscape. But we talk way less just about idea management, basically the idea of heading in the right direction. And it's bigger than data, right? It's not just data. It's about how we think, talk, and communicate with each other. A/B testing isn't enough. We need so much more. As a starter, what we need to do, which is great with polling that we just talked about, we need to record our beliefs before we measure and look back then at our past selves as we get new data and new information. The only reason that we do this is so that we can somehow record what you believed a second ago so that you remember that you were actually wrong. If we don't go through this process, you're just going to sit there and think throughout the talk, I know that, I know that, I know that too, even though you just changed your mind, right? Because we have that habit of just updating our beliefs without even realizing that we've been wrong. So unless we re-record what we believed, we'll neglect our mistakes. So it's crucial to make that a part of your testing process. It's not enough to just run those tests. What we're really looking for, I think, is to create institutionalized disconfirmation. For example, in trials, Think about it. Prosecutors and defense lawyers take on opposing sides. In science, new theories go through extensive peer reviews in the process of slowly becoming accepted. And companies run one single A/B test and think we have an uncovered and undeniable truth about a product. Our processes should require disagreement for an idea to be accepted. In other words, we should institutionalize disconfirmation in our processes. Lastly, I think we need to make everyone in a team organization dare to say the 3 most difficult words in the English language, being "I don't know." And the scientific community figured out this ages ago. You don't ever actually have to say those 3 words, because you can just say, instead of "I don't know," you just say "I have an hypothesis," which is basically the same thing, but you also get an opportunity to share that you have maybe an idea, or maybe you can say "I have a few hypotheses." You can share a few ideas of how it could work, but you're humble and you show that you're not sure of the answer, and you can use it with others. If someone has a really strong opinion, you can just always ask, "What's your hypothesis?" and try to make them humble about that it's difficult to judge. Then before we measure, of course, we should have to define in our companies our hypothesis and what metrics we're looking to change. Unless we define exactly what metrics we're looking to change, we're back here again, and we can just run a test and look for facts after we run the test to prove that we were right. We just see a number that changed and say, "Great, that's probably good, so let's run with it." If we do all this, and so much more, I think, hopefully, I think we can come to our companies and just relax, take a deep breath, and then be genuinely curious at work. And I think that would lead to way better decision making at our workplaces. Thank you.